السيدات والولايات السادة الأفاضل السلام عليكم.
Ladies and gentlemen, may the blessings of God be upon you all. We are starting our second session of today, held by the Arab Center, regarding our discussion on the American elections. The first session tried to focus on the election as they stand from the point of view of the internal situation in the United States. We will try to focus our attention on the possible repercussions of these elections on us in the Middle East and also the United States itself, and in particular relations with the GCC, Gulf countries, and relations with Iran and the Palestinian question. We will have two interventions. Our speakers will be Dr. Mehran Kamrava first. He will be talking about the possible repercussions of the American elections so far as Iran and the Gulf area are concerned. He will be followed by Dr. Osama Irsheed. He will speak on the Palestinian question. We start with Dr. Mehran Kamrava, and his talk will be the American elections, repercussions on Iran and the GCC and the Gulf area. Dr. Mehran Kamrava heads the Iranian Studies Unit at the Arab Center for Research and Policy Studies. The center started around 9 months ago. He also lectures at Georgetown University in Qatar. He has many publications to his name pertaining to the Iranian foreign policy and the Gulf area. Dr. Mehran, you have 20 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Dr. Haidar. I'm delighted to be here and to spend a few moments with you and colleagues here in Qatar and around the world. I should start by saying that this election is being followed most closely in Iran, probably more closely than any of the other recent elections. Particularly, there is great worry around the re-election of President Donald Trump, largely because of the maximum pressure policy that he has been that he has implemented over the last 2.5, 3 years. So what I will do is to start with a brief discussion of what the United States Iran policy is going to look like if Donald Trump were to be re-elected. I will then say a couple of things about the US and the GCC in Trump's second term, and then end with a discussion of a potential or a possible Biden presidency. So let me start out by saying that if Donald Trump were to be re-elected, we're likely to see a continuation of the maximum pressure policy that the United States has been implementing against Iran. This maximum pressure policy has manifested itself in multiple ways, but most acutely in terms of comprehensive sanctions being imposed on Iran on a variety of fronts. These are sanctions that go beyond trade. They also extend into banking. And of course, they now have started to impact seriously Iran's trade with other countries in the European Union, in Asia, and in particular with China and India. Iran has been trading in non-oil products. It has engaged in a fair amount of barter. And in many ways, over the last decade or so, because Iran has been under sanctions since 1979, over the last decade or so, Iran has in many ways mastered the art of skirting sanctions and sanctions avoidance. Nevertheless, the sanctions have become increasingly more comprehensive in the sense that they are now punishing those who in any shape or form engage in trade with Iran. To give you a small example, recently there was an Emirates flight that flew over Iranian airspace, and this Emirates flight shared a code share with an American airliner, and as a result, the United States imposed a fine of $400,000 on Emirates Airlines. So there's that degree of careful attention on the part of the American establishment. This is likely to continue. President Trump has said that most likely his first phone call will either come from or will be to Tehran the first week that he's reelected. Now, is this part of his rhetoric? We don't know. Is he actually going to threaten Iran with war? He hasn't necessarily said exactly why Iran would come to the negotiating table in a second term. One thing is for certain. Historically, we've seen that the Iranians have, so far at least, not responded predictably to threats coming from Washington, D.C., and that American threats directed at Iran have yet failed to bring the Iranians to the negotiating table. Now, we also know that President Trump himself is not in favor of war. There is a palpable sense in Tehran that if Trump were to be reelected, a second Trump administration is likely to wage war on Iran. I am not as certain. In fact, I do not think that the president himself is eager to engage in any sort of open conflict with Iran. Whether or not Secretary Pompeo or folks like Elliot Abrams, who is the president's special envoy on Iran and Venezuela, whether or not they are as reticent to engage in conflict with Iran is a completely different example. Certainly, the American foreign and security policy establishment under this administration has been quite eager to, quote unquote, punish Iran for its behavior. What we have seen also is a determination on the part of the Iranians not only to engage in vitriolic rhetoric back, but to also use their missile capabilities, as we saw in the aftermath of the assassination of General Qasem Soleimani. So given the fact that the Iranians are willing to use their missiles capability, I think what we have is a situation of mutually assured destruction, if you will, and that is likely to serve as a break to open hostilities in a second Trump administration between Iran and the United States. Let me say a couple of things about Trump policy towards the GCC. I fully agree with what my colleague Khalil Jayshan said earlier. I'll just say this. If a Trump administration were to be reelected, we're likely to see a continuation of what is in many ways a redo of Nixon's twin pillars policy. In Trump's first administration, we see that what the United States has done is in many ways to subcontract its foreign policy in the Middle East to two powers, Saudi Arabia and Israel. Now, what we have seen more recently is that it's Israel on the one side and Saudi Arabia / UAE on the other side. This policy, if you will call it 2.5 pillars policy or twin pillars policy, is very likely to continue in a second Trump administration. We will continue to see a reassertion of America's blunt power in the Middle East writ large, and specifically in relation to the Arabian Peninsula, in relation to the GCC, and Trump's rather blunt assertion of American interests globally, regionally, and of course here locally as well. I don't think anything would be different. In fact, what we're likely to see is a continuation of a trend of American pressure on its regional allies to recognize Israel formally. what has already occurred informally, which is extensive trade and diplomatic relations between the GCC states and Israel, is likely to assume more formal format under a second Trump presidency. Now, what would happen if Biden were to be elected? Let's just say a couple of things about Biden. And I'll say a couple of things about a potential or possible Biden administration and Iran. American sanctions against Iran are broadly of two kinds. One is a kind that has been enacted into law by the US Congress. The others are a second category of sanctions that have been imposed through executive order by the president. So even if Biden were to be reelected, and even if somehow he wanted to reverse American sanctions on Iran, he would not be able to do so, at least not in the immediate run. And there is also no guarantee that Tehran would be willing to return to the negotiating table to negotiate with the United States. Those voices in Tehran that have been advocating negotiations with the United States have been effectively silenced and overwhelmed by the so-called principalists and the hardliners in Iran that are in no mood to negotiate with the United States and come to any sort of a negotiating table. So a Biden presidency is likely to have a much tougher time establishing trust with Iran in the same way that Obama and Kerry did prior to their departure from office. So while we are likely to see a cooling down of the sharp rhetoric, we're likely to see a reduction of tensions. We're not likely to see substantive changes in Iran's relations with the United States in a Biden presidency. Let's also remember that Iran is heading to the polls for presidential elections next summer in May or June. And as a result, those presidential elections present a big question mark into how Iranian politics will take shape over the next 4.5 years. Finally, a Biden policy towards the GCC is likely to be far more nuanced and far less blunt as compared to Trump's presidency and Trump's approach. Nevertheless, the ship has already sailed. UAE's relations with Israel, Bahrain's relations with Israel have already shaped and changed in many ways the strategic landscape here in the GCC. And I sincerely doubt if we won't necessarily see, for example, close relations between Saudi Arabia, Israel, and the United States, or even Qatar, Israel, in a Biden administration. I'll stop there and we'll be happy to answer any questions that might come in the Q&A session.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mehran, for this introduction and intervention, and for the way the likely scenarios are if Trump is re-elected or Biden is elected. And of course, this is one of the most complex issues that the world eagerly awaits the development of. Now I move to Dr. Osama Abu Irsheed, and he will be dealing with the second complex issue, which has seen unprecedented developments lately, like the moving of the American embassy to Jerusalem and allowing the Netanyahu government to expand in its annexation policies, and the normalization of relations between Israel and a number of Arab countries, which is something unprecedented. Dr. Osama will deal with the impact or the likely impact of the American elections on the Palestinian questions, and he'll speak on the American policy toward the Palestinian questions between Biden and Trump. He is a non-resident fellow in our Washington Center, and he has many publications on Hamas and the Jordanian-Israeli relations. You have 20 minutes, Dr. Osama. Thank you, Dr. Haidar, and thank you, Arab Center, for this invitation. I will divide my talk into three sections. First being a general framework of American policy toward the Palestinian question so that we don't make a mistake in understanding the American policy toward the Palestinian question and what has Trump has done or added. In fact, the title will be what was the new development or steps that Trump has added to this question. In the general framework, there is a given to that whenever the American policy is discussed towards Israel or the Israeli-Palestinian questions, and this is the supposition that the Donald Trump administration has made a shift or a departure from the American administration's policies from 1947 until now, and he has come up with something new. What is the American approach that these commentators say that Trump has departed from? This opinion goes to say that any solution of the Arab-Israeli dispute and the Palestinian-Israeli dispute should be dealt with jointly through negotiations. And until 1967, it was supposedly a discussion between Arabs and Israelis, and after 67, the Palestinians were added to that possible negotiation. Then we have this approach of imposing a de facto situation. Of course, the Trump administration has recognized Jerusalem as capital of Israel. They stopped funding the UNRWA in 2018. And the aim behind that was to redefine who is Palestinian refugee. This way, they hope to cancel out maybe 90 or 95% of Palestinian refugees from the refugee statehood, and then the hence was cutting off the funding and recognition of Jerusalem as capital, and then redefine America's legal opinion of the Israeli settlements were always been contradictory to the diktats of international law, of course. Then they came up with the concept of the so-called deal of the century and peace in return for economic boom or whatever. Therefore, if we take into account all these considerations, we can safely say that this is an imposition and dictation of solution on the Palestinian side. It's true that these are very advanced steps for the sake of Israel, but in fact, in reality, the only difference between the Trump administration and all other previous American administrations is the degree of bias towards Israel. Every administration that came to power try to be more biased towards Israel and more in preference of Israel's rights at the expense of the Arab rights and the Palestinians. This has been a constant American position since the administration of Woodrow Wilson, and the British government could not dare give the Balfour Declaration if it wasn't for the support of the Woodrow Wilson, and then different administrations continued on this path until Donald Trump. No American administration has ever been neutral. They've all been towards Israel since 1917 and the Balfour Declaration. So, what is the new that Donald Trump has added? I don't see this new addition represented by these steps of moving the embassy, recognizing Jerusalem as capital, recognizing the Golan Heights as Israeli territory, or they were not just steps taken in a vacuum. The new thing that Trump has added, they have practically allowed themselves to be used as a conduit for more right wing and ultra wing policies to go through them. We no longer are speaking of support and bias, but we are talking about total empathy and more extremist and more right wing towards Israel and the right wing policies in Israel. For this way, we can understand why the Trump administration wants a regional approach, as they term it, for any solution for the Palestinian question. But how has this administration become a conduit for ultra right wing policies? This has been achieved through central figures in the Trump administration. There are three, in fact: Jared Kushner, the president's advisor and son in law, who practically is in charge of the Middle East dossier, and he has managed all these breakthroughs. And then Justin Greenblatt, who was formerly the peace advocate. Now we have Abby Gabrovich, who is also biased towards Israel, and the other central figure is David Friedman. Jason Friedman, Jared Kushner, and the other are known to be absolutely biased towards Zionism and Israel. We're no longer talking about their religious affiliation. We have many who have served in the different administrations who are of Jewish origin, who are biased to Israel, definitely, but they have never been with so close collaboration and ready to make the administration a conduit for policies of the right wing under the leadership of a populist president who he just seeks any vote that be cast in his favor, and he always tries to appease his own power base regardless of others. And we know the evangelical and the others who voted for him, and they see that Israel is not a political issue only, but is an issue of religious allegiance and the second return of the Christ. I don't want to go into these details, but Israel is part and parcel of their agenda, and Trump has always wanted to be in contact with this power base, and he always needed them to consolidate his power base and his support base. So therefore, I'm talking about total empathy, and this administration has, for all intents and purposes, has become a conduit for such policies, and for this reason, they place all their attention on a regional approach to make the entire region carry the burden of any solution. And we saw in June 2016 how there was the economic side of the peace effort, so-called peace effort, and then we saw in January the political side of the so-called deal of the century. We will soon discover that the solution will not be Palestinian Israeli. It will not deal with the question of refugees. The solution will be through Israel and the region, and 50 or 60 Muslim countries should welcome the Palestinian refugees and welcome them as brother Arabs or Muslims and forget about the right of return to Israel. And of course, there will be no Palestinian state which has sovereignty or official borders or able to be integrated with the rest of the region except through Israel and its control over its borders, so that Israel can win both ways through exporting and importing with this Palestinian entity. And this is in total agreement with the position of the far right in Israel, which sees that the Israeli occupation in Israel should not pay the price for the existence of Palestinians in Israel and the region, but the entire region. This is what Trump has offered Israel and what has distinguished his administration from all the previous administrations. And when Donald Trump when he says on the phone in a manner which contravenes with all diplomatic norms. So he asked Netanyahu, "Who was best for you? Is it me or Sleepy Joe?" Of course, he even embarrassed Netanyahu on the phone because practically he is really turning the entire question of the relations between the U.S. and Israel into a personal standpoint of him personally and his total empathy with Israel. And Netanyahu today has finds himself squeezed in the corner because if if he is to uh, pay Trump the same compliment against Biden, he would pay for that in the Israeli elections. So, what are we to expect from Joe Biden? I want to remind us that we are not talking about a person who has no previous experience or someone who is unknown so far as his political um, as political experience is concerned. He was a member of the Senate. He was vice president under Obama for 8 years. And he was also engaged in politics for over 40 years in the United States. He was involved in the Israeli Palestinian questions. In 2010, he visited occupied Palestine and Israel, and the Israelis surprised him by the announcement of building new settlements, which was one of the causes of tension between the Obama administration and Israel. So, therefore, we are talking here about someone who's known, whose role in the Arab Israeli dispute is known. If we want to speak generically, and from a general point of view, his administration will be an extension of the Obama administration. The same position of the two-state solution, a state where two peoples can live side by side in peace and security. And personally, Biden, I'm almost certain that he will not approach the relations with Israel in any confrontational manner, and any pressures he is likely to activate on Israel will not be economic, they will be diplomatic, they will not be in the political. Obama insisted on the two-state solution, said Israel has to stop settlements or free settlements. Israel never paid attention, and he ended up with increasing America's aid to Israel from 1 point something billion dollars to 3 point something billion dollars. Of course, when Trump came to power and before his inauguration in 2016, Obama's administration, practically speaking, got some sort of a revenge, maybe, or I don't want to call that like when Netanyahu came to the US and addressing the Congress without Obama's notice. The Obama administration retaliated with uh, UN Security Council resolution on settlements. Of course, it was not a binding resolution, and Israel will have nothing to worry about it except for redefining the occupied territories and reconstituting West Jerusalem as part of the occupied territories. David Friedman, America's ambassador to Israel, in a statement a few days ago, said that Biden's election will be harmful to Israel and the Gulf. I will focus on the Israeli side of things and not the Gulf side. Uh, 2 weeks prior to that, the Israeli Council of Civil Planning met and announced a project to build almost 5,000 units of settlements, and also they announced that the scientific cooperation between the United States and Israel will be expanded to include the West Bank because Israel fears that if Biden comes to power, he will not give Israel these rights, so they want to expand their control as much as possible because maybe the annexation from the point of view of the Trump administration was frozen, maybe suspended, but not cancelled. So therefore, practically speaking, Israel continues the annexation, but not announcing that formally and officially, but through steps taken inside Israel through allowing ownership of these land. So they're expediting these steps to swallow up as much as they can from the lands for fear of winning the election. I think this is exaggerated somewhat because historically speaking, Biden has always been a friend of Israel, although he will not go as far as allowing the administration to be a conduit for far right policies. But by and large, he will still be a friend of Israel and a supporter of Israel. If we talk about being biased without being totally in empathy with Israel, let's take a look at the manifesto of the Democratic Party. Biden interfered personally to formulate that statement in the past relating to the Palestinian question. He said on the one side that he wants a Palestinian state, a viable Palestinian state, but he also did not want to mention the word Israeli occupation. The word Israeli occupation was deleted completely, and he does not want to link military aid to Israel to Israeli policies because there are some members of the progressive wing of the Democratic Party who wanted to link military aid to Israel to Israeli policies. He refuses that and he rejected it. And he said he will not return the embassy to Tel Aviv, but he may reopen the American consulate in East Jerusalem. In other words, the embassy will stay in Jerusalem because this is a de facto situation now. I will not punish Israel by threatening them to cut off military aid or cutting aid uh, in reality, but he will at the same time not change anything that the Donald Trump has done on the ground. So we are still faced with a situation of being biased towards Israel, but not in total empathy with it. Also, returning humanitarian aid will be difficult because that is linked to the approval of the Congress, because there are previous resolutions which the Congress does not allow any financial aid to the Palestinian Authority as long as it gives pensions to the families of those who committed terrorist activities. So the bias would continue as it was without being in total empathy. Will be mistaken to hope any more than that, and anybody who's hoping that the Biden administration will be more sympathetic toward the Palestinians will be mistaken. They'll continue in the same path as the Trump and other previous or administrations, but it's true that there is a progressive wing within the Democratic Party and they are more sympathetic toward the Palestinians. 35% of them are sympathetic to the Palestinians and 15% towards Israel. But until now, this wing has not been able to impact the decisions by the executive committee of the party itself. So if we must bank more on the future by consolidating this progressive wing within the Democratic Party, maybe in the future, but not in the next Biden administration. They'll be less biased, but still biased towards Israel.
شكرا دكتور أسامة على هذه المداخلة وعلى توضيح
Thank you, Dr. Osama, for this intervention and for clarifying the differences between Trump's and Biden's policies vis-a-vis the Palestinian dossier. So I would like to give the floor to any interventions, for any questions. I will actually read the questions that we have. We have some questions on social media platforms, and we also have some Q&A chat box questions, and also Dr. Khalil, Dr. Joe, you can also answer. We have a question by Ahmad Al-Khalifi. So he's asking about the position of the Iranians and the Iraqis. Are they favoring Trump or Biden? And I think he means the people of Iraq and people of Iran and not the government. Nadia Abu Zahir has a question to Dr. Mehran. Why don't you expect Trump, should he win, to go to war against Iran? So why are you excluding this, or why do you think that this is not probable? And also, Muhammad Mukhtar, Mr. Muhammad Mukhtar says the US policy will not change vis-a-vis Iran should Biden win because of the Israeli influence on US foreign policy. This is according to Mr. Muhakkar. And also Mr. Dr. Salam. Dr. Salam, you have a question? Thank you, Dr. Haidar. Unfortunately, I could not join you since the beginning because we are the older generation that are not uh, we are not comfortable with the new technologies. So the Russian factor, is it really influential, whether this time or the previous time? We have had a lot of questions and a lot of uh, things were discussed. So Russia, despite Putin's attempts to strengthen Russia's position in the world, I don't think that Russia has such an influence. Maybe the Soviet Union and previous years and decades used to be more important when it comes to US elections. And now, just now, we are starting to read previously classified documents, and we are seeing how the Kremlin used to finance some campaigns as part of the Cold War calculations. I would like to ask the speakers, can we really talk about a Russian influence when it comes to US elections, just like Washington is saying? Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Salam. Always with written questions before Mr. Walid Salem. We have a question from Dr. Khalid Hashim. It is actually a lengthy question, but I summarized it. What is important for Trump is Iran and not the peace process between the Palestinians and the Israelis. Therefore, he seeks to bring together collective Arab efforts to face Iran. So this is the summary of Dr. Khalid's intervention. Our colleague, Mr. Salman Najjar, the correspondent of Al Arabi TV in Doha, has a question to Dr. Khalil Jashan. Would the UAE KSA access be affected by a Biden presidency? And what is the vision of Biden to solve the Gulf crisis? Mr. Walid, the floor is yours, sir. Dr. Walid Salem from Jerusalem. In fact, I had two questions, that were not covered. Uh, I would like to start with the first question, first topic relating to the inversing of the image when it comes to the US Palestinian relationship. Let us ask the question, what is the impact on the US Palestinian relationship should Mahmoud Abbas no longer be here? And what are the alternatives? Would we have new, for example, leaders who can support Trump's project? Should he win another presidency? Could we see another normalization model? Also, the Gaza issue. The White House hosted a workshop about Gaza under Trump with the supervision of Kushner. What would the fate of the Gaza Strip be under Trump's presidency? When it comes to the first session, the influence in the United States. We did not talk about popular diplomacy. We talked about official diplomacy, talking about official relationships at the American, Arab, and Palestinian levels. But what about popular diplomacy, the role of the Palestinian and Arab diaspora? My question, I was always thinking about it, to what extent can we talk about a working unit between Palestinian and Arab communities and their supporters in the circles of the Democrats and the BDS in order to put together a systematic plan to influence US policies in order to bring uh, a US president in 2024 or 2028, at least unbiased president? Is it like a dream? Is it like a topic? Or we can talk about some real action plan that would lead to a change in the US administration? Thank you so much. Thank you, Dr. Walid. We also have a question, Ahmad Al Khlifi. So, asking the speakers about the increasing voting percentage among the youth in 2016 and this year. Let us go back to the panelists and listen to their answers. Dr. Mehran, the floor is yours, sir. Could you please give us your opinion regarding what you.
Thank you, Dr. Haidar. There was a question about why I don't think a Trump administration would go to war with Iran. And of course, this is just an educated guess. We don't really know from day to day how Donald Trump is going to act, and he revels in being unpredictable. He actually enjoys being unpredictable and keeping people guessing. But I think because the Iranians have demonstrated a willingness to strike back lethally, then that would give the Americans pause. The Americans, historically, we've seen, have not been willing to engage in a conflict in which they don't think they will win. And last time, when the Iranians struck back after Qasem Soleimani's assassination, they fully intended that the Americans would retaliate. And the Iranian high command, the Revolutionary Guard, came out and said that they had already picked 5 targets across the Middle East that they were going to attack, 5 American targets that they were going to attack. And also they openly said that any country in the region which will allow the Americans to use their base to attack Iran is fair game. As a result, I think the Iranian willingness to strike back and inflict serious damage to American interests would serve as a natural break to the possibility of an open conflict. There was another question about who the Iranians would prefer to win the presidential election. That's an excellent question. I think the average person would much prefer to see a Biden presidency as compared to a Trump presidency. But if we are to believe the FBI last week, when they said that Iran was trying to interfere and intimidate American voters from voting for Trump, if that indeed happened, and I think that's a huge if that happened, then apparently there are segments within the Iranian government that favor a Trump presidency. These are likely to be Iranian hardliners that, similar to Trump and his circle, revel in conflict with the United States. There was a third question about whether or not the United States would, under Biden, would change policy in regards to Iran because of the pervasive influence of groups such as AIPAC and other Israeli lobby groups or pro-Israeli lobby groups. I quite agree. I think the atmosphere in the United States, both in terms of American popular culture, in terms of American media, but also in policy circles, is so anti-Iranian nowadays that I think it would be very difficult for a Trump or for a Biden presidency rather to change its Iranian policy. I'll just say one last thing. Often we hear that the United States or Europe and their regional allies are against Iranian nuclear program. I think that's a red herring. If Iran tomorrow were to start producing something, for example, like shoelaces, suddenly we are going to hear from the United States and its allies that Iranian shoelaces are somehow threat to regional and world peace. So no matter what the Iranians do, I think the atmosphere in the United States is so decidedly anti-Iranian that any meaningful change in American policy towards Iran is likely to be quite difficult. I'll stop there and let my other colleagues take some of the other questions.
شكرا جزيلا دكتور مهران. دكتور أسامة.
Thank you, Dr. Mehran. Dr. Osama, I would like to allow you to answer. Also, there are two questions and more details. Nadia Buzahir, Ahmed Al-Khlayfi asked, should Biden win, what do you expect him to do vis-a-vis the annexation policy that the Netanyahu government is implementing? What would he do vis-a-vis the deal of the century and the normalization? And Shahida is asking you, what advice can you give to the Palestinian Authority that is counting on the Biden victory? Thank you, Dr. Haidar. When it comes to the annexation, in order to clarify the picture, what Israel wants is applying sovereignty. Applying sovereignty has an internal domestic Israeli legal aspect, not only international law aspect. Israel wants to applying sovereignty, which gives the Israeli government to annex these territories and make them subject to civil Israeli laws and not only martial or military laws. So this law, I do not. This doesn't mean that I accept it or agree, but this means that Israel can annex the territories by applying sovereignty, as opposed to the previous system, which used to rely on military aspect. Now we can talk about the civil aspect of the law. So, according to Israel, this is Israeli territory, and Israel is controlling these territories. This is what Israel wanted, and this is what Mr. Trump wanted to give Israel. But things changed because internally we have Gantz and Netanyahu heading heading government, and also there was a bigger potential for Israel through the normalization with different Arab countries. So this is the position that Israel wanted and Trump wanted. But with Biden, we would be facing a different picture. I do not think that Biden would allow annexing without agreeing with the Palestinian Authority, the exchange of territories. This would not be guaranteed. But this does not mean that Israel would not continue to do so as it did under the Obama administration or the Clinton administration, talking about Democrats, and of course, under Republican administration. It will continue annexing the territories, but without applying sovereignty. So it will be a de facto sovereignty, but not legal understanding or concept. As to the advice, to the Palestinian Authority, if we can remember the situation under Obama administration, I think that Biden will be a less quality replica of Barack Obama's administration. If Obama is a hero for the Palestinians and the Palestinian Authority, I can say that Biden is of lesser quality, but we know that Obama was no hero and his administration offered nothing to the Palestinians. I would like to go back to the role of the institutions and the diaspora. This is, I'm talking from my office. These alliances are here in the United States, and we have advanced alliances in the United States in favor of Palestine. We have the Palestine Solidarity Movement in the United States. It is not Palestinian, it is not Arab, it is not Islamic only. We are talking about alliances with Jewish Voices for Peace, if not now, Latin, Hispanic, Christian, progressive groups working, favoring, advocating for Palestine. And we had the Palestine Advocacy Day, the biggest event, the Congress. Of course, it was virtual because of the pandemic, but this conference witnessed the participation of 800 participants, and more than 55% were not Palestinian or Arab or Muslim. So most of them were, or a huge percentage, 20% were Jewish American, and we had more than 219 meetings within the Congress, within congressmen and women, and also meetings with uh, the members of parliament and also senators. And this reveals the alliances existing, the BDS, this diplomacy the popular diplomacy is here. We should not count on the Biden administration, but we should count on the Democrats, Bernie Sanders, but we can talk about AOC and other figures moving forward within the Democratic Party. Last point, the Palestinian cause will not be a priority for Biden. He has a crisis. He has the coronavirus crisis, the economy, China, the relationship with the allies. America is in a state of chaos. Trump, or Biden, sorry, will face challenges. But it seems that, and I have met Tony Blinken, who is the senior advisor for foreign policy to Biden. Palestine will be among the priorities, and Mr. Biden would reiterate the two-state solution. But would Mr. Biden focus on working on this scenario? I do not think so, but I would like to because we are short on time, I will not continue. I will give the opportunity to my colleagues. Thank you, Dr. Osama. Before moving to Dr. Khalil, and if you want to answer some questions, we also have Najwa al-Bashir asking about the role of the Congress. Why focusing on the president's role? Why not focusing on the Congress's role and the Democratic majority? How would the Congress influence the U.S. foreign policy should Trump remain president? This is a valuable question, a very important question. As a person who has experience for more than 40 years in this field, maybe this is the least understood uh, aspect in the Arab world, the role of the Congress, because of the nature of Arab regimes, particularly at the official level, the deal or the communication with the United States used to be restricted to the executive branch. without taking into account the Congress role because of the lack of similar uh, parliamentary and legislative activities in the region. The Congress has a major role in shaping up the US foreign policy. The big problem when it comes to Arab issues and the Palestinian cause, the Congress was for long years controlled by the Zionist lobby. This hegemony is still there, but it is less to a lesser extent. There are gaps within the Congress, and this justifies a better activity in the United States by Arabs and Muslims in order to fill this vacuum. Just like Osama said, there are some endeavors at this level, but we have yet to see serious results. Of course, the Congress is important, and in the past, maybe we got to 60, 70, 80, and sometimes 100 congressmen uh, sympathizing with some Arab causes. But this is a limited percentage. Dr. Walid asked the question, is it a utopia? Is it a dream? Of course, it is utopia. It is a dream. But at the same time, change always begins after dreams and utopia. This is the result. Change is the result of utopia and dreams. So it is very important to move in this direction. When it comes to the question regarding the change at the level of the Palestinian leadership, of course, there are uh, requests, demands regarding the change of the leadership, but this also relies on the change in the US and in Israel, because Israel will shortly face electoral challenges and who is going to be the prime minister in the future. There is no, Francia, there is no magic solution when it comes to Mahmoud Abbas going away, just like some people expected in the US. President Abbas is He forgives me if I talk about some personal talk that happened between us. He's still asking questions about the animosity that Trump is showing towards him. What happened? Especially that the first and second meetings were positive. So Mr. Abbas is not convinced when it comes to the explanations, trying to explain why Mr. Trump changed his mind. Trump is very difficult to deal with, even with the closest allies of the United States. Many people talked about this. Trump has a lot of problems. He does not accept the agreement. He is a populist president, and despite his support and his surprise to this to some or vis-a-vis some issues that were raised at the Palestinian level, but he changed his mind because his advisors uh, actually decide on his foreign policy. So the change of leadership in Palestine would not affect her directly, and it's not the magic solution because it relies on changes in US and Israel. Dr. Joe had something I'd like to say that there were more aspirations. Of course, the viewers, the participants wanted us to cover more issues. Muhammad Al Hadithi asks, the this event did not cover the Iraqi aspect. Dr. Tahir says that Biden and the memory of Iraqi people is linked with calling for three federal states or three states actually, so the division of Iraq. So, what about the Biden approach vis-a-vis the Syrian dossier? Abu Bakr is asking regarding the US policy vis-a-vis Sudan. Should Biden win? Would the extortion come to an end? Dr. Joe, do you have any comment? Yes, I will try to answer these questions. First of all, when it comes to the Congress and the influence of the Congress, of course, the House is important, and the is also a possibility at the level of the Senate. Even Lindsey Graham is facing several challenges in North or South Carolina, and this is a big indicator. So, if this shifts towards the Democratic Party, this would be one of the more important indicators. It was impossible months ago to get a majority in the Senate, but now it is possible. 17% are not favoring Biden, but they are closer to Democrats and liberals. This is why it will also be decisive in Michigan, especially the universities in Texas. They are part of the post-recession generation, post-Gulf Gulf War generation, and also the Russia issue was briefly mentioned. The problem when it comes to Russian intervention was regarding the hacking of the voting process. And of course, Trump made it difficult. As to the foreign influence in general, it is not new. We can go back to the World War One, World War Two, Hitler. It is not new, but the nature of social media and the nature of the new technologies allow it even more. When it comes to Iraq, the margin of the US policy is very limited in Iraq. They do not have options. It is uh, necessary to live with Iran or face Iran. Biden is closer to the military institution. Biden wants to reduce pressure. Biden does not want to open up a new front. And there is a long-term issue regarding the lighter military presence, and this is a different approach. So, uh, uh, arranging the division of control. When it comes to Syria, also there is a lot of restrictions. So Biden cannot go back when it comes to the sanctions, and he has a complicated relationship with Erdogan and Putin. Trump also does not have a vision when it comes to the Syrian dossier. What about Biden? What about Biden's perception of the sanction regime? I think in general, Biden will focus more on China and Russia and less on the Middle East, but I will try to manage the crisis. So that was a quick comment. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Joe. Dr. Khalil, I would like to add 2 points regarding the foreign influence. Of course, just like our colleagues said, the foreign influence or the attempt to influence is not something new. But the problem this time is that since the arrival of Trump, the focus is on Trump. So usually there are accusations addressed to Russia and China, but we have been following up uh, the elections in the United States. Israel has been the biggest foreign state to intervene in the US election. But until now, this has not been highlighted. Also, the Arab influence. Very few articles were written about this, but some interventions by Gulf states were not mentioned as blatant intervention in U.S. domestic affairs. So this is very important to remember. Thank you.
شكرا جزيلا دكتور. طيب
Thank you, doctor.
هناك المزيد من الأسئلة لكننا تجاوزنا
So we have more questions, but we ran out of time. Unfortunately, we ran out of time. I know that we can still be debating this topic or these topics for a long period of time. We are talking about a key political event with key repercussions all over the world and in our region. Of course, we will stop. The Arab Center will uh, discuss the elections, and we will have also a conference uh, after the elections, and papers were published, and of course the center will uh, follow closely. I would like to thank all the speakers, the panelists, and I would like to thank the participants. Thank you. Salam alaikum.